This is the last of our series on AI and Christian ethics, number 6. So thank you for coming. We have two very knowledgeable speakers this morning. And so I'm just going to frame the discussion a little bit with a few thoughts from Romans 14. And then we will we'll pray. I'll pray, and then we'll get going. So I want to just start by talking about Romans 14, which speaks to gray areas, ethical gray areas. And there are a lot of ethical gray areas in AI. For some people, not so much. AI is just not a good thing at all. For others, it's just a tool, like a hammer. You can use it to build a house, or you can use it to destroy something. It's good or bad, maybe depending on how you use it. And so one thing I want to make sure after last week's discussion is we saw some healthy disagreement last week on AI, even amongst our pastoral staff, and that's not a bad thing. What's good is that we understand that when we disagree, the Bible's very clear on how we handle it when we disagree about gray areas, okay? So 3 quick points. These are taken from Romans 14, and because we've got a heavy agenda, I'm not going to take the time to read that passage, but 3 things are important in my mind. First, is it truly a gray area or not? Idolatry is not a gray area. Deep fakes and deception are not a gray area. There's a lot of black and white, right, biblically. We know. We're going to hear a little bit about AI used in embryo selection for IVF. To me, that's not a gray area. I think, we'll hear more about that. But there are gray areas. And so the first thing we got to ask is, are we talking about a gray area or not? In AI, there are a lot of gray areas. I've seen it used for good. When I was a chief information officer of a company, I used AI to keep the bad guys out with our security software. That was a good, and to me, a proper use. But not everybody agrees on all of how AI is used. So is it a gray area or is it a biblical command? And so that's a question we need to ask as we're talking about this stuff. The second thing that Paul says very clearly, and his discussion is about some people felt they could eat certain foods. Maybe they had a Jewish background or they couldn't eat certain foods. And some people thought, hey, it's fine to eat these foods. And Paul speaks to those ethically gray areas. And he stresses that when you disagree on something that's gray, don't judge the person who maybe abstains when you don't, and don't judge the person who maybe participates when you don't think you could in good conscience participate. And the example I always heard growing up was alcohol. I have a lot of Baptist friends. I grew up in a Baptist church, and alcohol was always something that was, verboten in any case. And I still have friends who believe that, and that's, I don't judge them. In fact, I encourage them in that. In fact, that was me for many, many years. But on the other hand, don't judge those as maybe too liberal who do, cautiously, have a glass of wine here and there and that sort of thing. So there's, let's not judge one another when we disagree is something Paul, because he doesn't want these issues to become something that divides the church. So we have to be really careful about that. And then the third thing is act before the Lord. Whatever you decide on your use of AI. My wife and I somewhat disagree. She doesn't use it. I use it for certain tasks and certain things that I do. But be convinced in your own mind fully before the Lord, Paul says. He says, when you do something, if you're not fully convinced, if it bothers your conscience and you're doing it anyway, it's not a good thing. So be fully convinced in your own mind. And then also let love limit liberty. When it comes to alcohol, I don't drink around friends that don't drink. We didn't have alcohol at my wedding, and I heard about it, believe me, from half the family who was very upset about it. But the other half, I had a lot of believers there who, really had a problem. So, in that situation, we limited our liberty in order to fulfill the law of love to our friends. And that's what I think Paul is advocating for. So that's it. That's what I want to say. But I wanted to frame the discussion with this because I think it's really important. When we disagree on gray areas, let's not let it become an obstacle. So let's pray, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bill. Father, thank you for the time we can spend thinking about these things. Give us wisdom, Lord, to live in this quickly changing world and to live in a way that brings you honor and glory, Lord Jesus Christ. I thank you for our speakers. I pray you'll give them wisdom as they talk to us this morning. Father, we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, Bill, coming up here. I'll let you introduce yourself, and clicker's right here.
Okay. You can hear me okay? For those of you who don't know me, excuse me, my name is Bill Drobyski. I work at MCW. I'm in the Division of Hematology Oncology, and more precisely in the bone marrow transplant program. So we take care of patients with blood cancers. Think of diseases like leukemia, lymphoma, multiple myeloma, that sort of the patient population. So we perform stem cell transplants in those patients. So Rick asked me to talk about precision medicine and AI. This is an extremely complicated topic. We could spend hours just talking about the precision medicine piece, let alone the AI piece. So I tried to, in 15 minutes, try to present some of the conceptual issues and then maybe give you some examples of things that reflect some of those issues. So I'm going to turn sideways a bit. Sorry to apologize for that, because on some of these slides are a little busy, but I just want to highlight certain things to try to get certain points across. So what is precision medicine? So historically, traditionally, you might have a group of 50 patients with a disease. Let's say those patients all have lung cancer. And in that setting, they would all get treated with generally the same treatment. This is kind of when I was getting trained. And then you'd have some patients would respond, some patients would not respond, some patients might have an adverse event, and then they wouldn't be able to complete the therapy, and that might be an untoward outcome because their disease might progress if they couldn't get therapy. But it would kind of be a one-size-fits-all approach. So in precision medicine, if you had to summarize precision medicine in one sentence, it's really trying to get the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. So how do we try to do that? Well, basically, you try to integrate a number of factors together when you think of a patient. You look at the genetics of their disease, which is really a critical point. Because I'm in the cancer space, that's some of this discussion that I'll show you in the ensuing slides will focus on cancer, since that's where I'm more familiar with. So you try to understand the unique genetics of the disease, how a particular person might respond to specific medicines, how you might metabolize specific medicines, what your lifestyle is, what environmental factors you may have been exposed to, your own personal health history, other comorbidities you may have, other disease entities you're dealing with that might affect how someone could be treated with another disease. So basically, you're trying to do personalized therapy. You've heard of precision medicine. You can think of it as personalized therapy. So instead of being one of 50, let's say, an N of 50, you are an N of 1, and trying to look at the patient as a unique entity. So how does this work in cancer? So historically in cancer, there's like a three-legged treatment stool in cancer, which is consisted of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, and surgery. So chemotherapy is designed to kill rapidly dividing cells, which cancer cells rapidly divide. But they're somewhat non-selective. That's why you may have seen people get chemotherapy and then their hair falls out because those cells divide quickly, or they have gastrointestinal issues because the GI tract turns over quickly. Radiation therapy, they'll design a specific field to treat a specific area, but there's often normal tissue that's in that field, and that can be damaged, and that can result in side effects. And then surgery, they may take out a piece of a tissue that's cancerous, but then there's also adjacent tissue. Depending on how much tissue you take out, you may compromise organ function, or it may affect the quality of your life. You can think of a patient who has colon cancer and has a piece of their colon taken out, and then they end up having a colostomy. So in the precision oncology space, what's that about then? How's that different? So Peter talked a little bit about math, so I'm going to try to take you back to biology a little bit, if you remember. So if you go back to biology, you'll remember DNA contains your genetic code. So DNA is transcribed to RNA, and then RNA is translated to proteins, and then proteins are the building blocks of your cells, which are then the building blocks of tissues and organs and things like that. So cancer is characterized by mutations that develop in your genes. A mutation can develop in a silent area of your DNA and not cause any problems. But it can also erupt for a variety of reasons, whether that's genetic or environmental exposure. If the gene that's mutated is in an area is a gene that suppresses the development of cancer, then that protein could be made non-functional and increase your risk of cancer. Alternatively, if that mutation occurs in a gene which now changes the function of that protein and gives it and confers upon that protein the ability for your cell to divide more rapidly and in uncontrolled fashion, that can lead to the development of cancer. So by understanding this allows us to unlock two forms of therapy which we previously didn't have. So if the cancer is expressing certain proteins on it that distinguishes it from normal tissues, then what you can try to do, and what's being done all throughout cancer therapy, is you can then try to get the immune system to recognize these cells in a way that's much more precise, because your immune system is designed to have a lot of precision. When you get the flu, your immune system targets all the flu-infected cells. It doesn't just attack every cell in your body. So in this setting, basically what is being tried to be done here is it's trying to unblind your immune system so that now it can see a cancer cell that previously it couldn't see. Because if it had seen it in the beginning, it would have gotten rid of it. So there's a variety of therapies. Some of these are on television where you're trying to reactivate your immune system so it's more precisely target your cancer cell. This is called immunotherapy. The other approach is to look at this protein that's been generated because of a mutation, and now ask the question, can we design a drug that interferes with the function of that protein, and then by doing that can specifically target the cancer cell because that's the cell that's expressing this abnormal protein. So that's called targeted therapies. And so those are kind of two more things now that you have in your armamentarium to be more precise in treating cancer. It doesn't eliminate these approaches, but it now gives you more of a precise targeting strategy. So if you try to look at this more at a higher level, you may have a lot of patients, and what the goal is to try to sequence the cancers in each of these patients, so then you can stratify these patients and you could say, okay, this person has a specific cancer with a specific mutation, it produces a specific protein, so we should give these patients treatment A, these patients treatment B, and then these patients treatment C. But these patients, we don't know what this mutation does, and we don't maybe have a therapy that's targeted, and we need to do more research. And at least at the MCW Cancer Center, the aspirational goal is to to sequence every single patient who comes in with cancer, sequence their cancer, and then to try to do a precision-guided therapy approach for their disease. Oops. There we go. This is overwhelming. Don't expect you to really make much of this, but I wanted to use it to illustrate something. So how does this work out in practice? This is a disease called acute myelogenous leukemia. It's a form of acute leukemia. We transplant patients with this not infrequently. It's usually an adult disease, although children can also get this. I want to make just a few points on this slide. If you look at every yellow box here, this is either a biological therapy or a drug that's being used or is actually in clinical care or being tested for the treatment of this disease. There's over 20 drugs here and biological approaches. Half of them are now actively being used in patient care. Some of them are now standard of care. If you look on some of these are expressed on the surface of the cell, as I mentioned to you, that opens the door to use like an immunotherapy approach. Many of these are inside of the cell, and so there are these drugs that are being used that can get inside and interfere with many of these signaling pathways. Everything on this slide was unknown when I started training decades ago. So this is all new in the last, several decades. So that's how far things have moved. And this is just one disease. You can imagine this is being looked at across the cancer cell spectrum. But you have to know what you're dealing with to do this. So like a patient with this mutation would need to get one of these drugs. Patient with this mutation would need to get one of these drugs. Patient here would need to get one of these drugs. If you don't know that, then you can't use that targeted therapy. You might use a therapy that is not effective. And then you can also prognosticate. Some of these mutations confer a bad risk, and then we would want to transplant these patients. Some mutations are good risk, and you can just get chemotherapy. So knowing this kind of unlocks a variety of things, how to give precise therapy, and also to help with prognosticating and let the patient know what the likelihood of success is. So how is AI used in precision oncology? Just a few examples. The models are used to try to interpret large data sets. This would consist of genetic data, electronic health records, to identify profiles for patients so you can plan diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. There are now AI algorithms to analyze like radiology scans, think of CAT scans, MRI, and then pathology slides so you can try to detect tumors with high accuracy. There are algorithms to try to predict how a patient responds to specific therapies, to help clinicians choose the most effective treatment and try to identify potential drug combinations. And then AI can be used to accelerate the identification of novel targets. It's like I showed you before, where you can try to identify, how a mutation confers a survival advantage on a cancer cell, and try to improve the efficiency of clinical trial design. So when patients come into our cancer center, there's an algorithm where you try to say, okay, what clinical trials might be open? What's the patient have? How can we match up the best clinical trial with what the patient has? And to try to do that in a coherent and rapid approach. There are also obviously challenges and ethical concerns with the use of AI. So one of these is the training algorithms use data sets. What if the data set just picks a certain group of patients that's not representative of a larger group of patients that would have this disease? You might be drawing conclusions that does not have ethnic and racial representation, and that could perpetuate biases and perhaps lead you to incorrect conclusions for certain patients. What about if AI makes a mistake? Who's responsible? Is it the hospital that it has the AI algorithms? Is it the doctor? Is it the person who developed the algorithm? Data storage. There's huge requirement for data storage. There was an estimate that in 2020 you'd need 1 quintillion bytes of data for healthcare. So there's a large requirement for data storage centers. I think this has been discussed here at previous Sunday school. There's large electricity requirements. They often put these data centers in sort of rural communities that don't always have the opportunity to push back. And so there's deeper societal implications for this. Privacy, there may be security flaws in software, hardware, which then could potentially lead to theft of health information. And are there third-party interests that are trying to accumulate data for profit-driven motives? And then this idea of dehumanization. So if you continue to rely on AI, are you leading to more impersonal care? If you're training a lot of young physicians to think of algorithms and just how I plug things in and then somebody gives me a list of what they think the patient has, are you moving away from critical thinking skills that you really need to be a physician? There was a saying when I was in medical school that when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses and not zebras. And what that meant was that common things are common, so that you should generally think about that, but that some people are zebras, and are you going to lose the opportunity to identify things that don't fit into a normal sphere because you're too wedded into sort of algorithms? And then this process of dehumanization. So this is Tommy, the robot nurse. This was in 2020 during COVID in Italy. So you may remember during the early stages of COVID, the Italian healthcare system was overwhelmed with COVID cases, and the hospitals were overwhelmed, and the nurses and the doctors were stretched. And this center in Italy decided that to try to help prevent healthcare people from getting sick and to try to manage the number of patients, that in the patients that were maybe less sick, although this person kind of looks sick because he has sort of this inverted glass bubble over his head and is getting perhaps oxygen, it's hard to tell. They decided that they would use these robotic devices. You wonder why they named it Tommy. It was because the head of the ICU was named Thomas, so they named the device after the ICU director. So they had these robotic devices that would sit in the room and monitor the patient and sort of so the nurse didn't have to go in the room. And the nurse, you can't see it here, but the robot actually has a couple eyes that are somewhat inviting and has a touch screen face. So the patient could type in exactly what the message they wanted to convey to the nurse or to the doctor. And that's how this would work. But you can imagine that this was a scary time for people. Patients, there was no good treatments. Often you didn't even get treatment until you were almost dead because you'd be on a ventilator and then they'd start treating you. So you can imagine being by yourself. All these patients were alone. Your family couldn't visit you. And, you know, Tommy has no hands or arms. Tommy can't hold your hand if you're scared. And so there is this dehumanization element with robotics that I think we have to keep in mind. So to pivot a little bit, we think of personalized medicine, precision oncology. You might think of the system is doing something to you. The medical healthcare system is doing something to you and you're sort of passive in absorbing what they're telling you to do. And my bias is that you should never abdicate responsibility for your medical care exclusively to the medical establishment, that the healthcare system tends to be somewhat non-transparent. It can be kind of opaque. It's not necessarily very nimble at times, and that you need to invest in your own healthcare. So you need to either take responsibility, or if you can't, have someone in your family or a friend or someone to advocate for your care. Now, if you're inclined to use AI, what it can do is it can help organize symptoms, help you draft a medical history, create a log, keep track of what's going on so you can maybe understand a little bit more what's happening, explain to your physician kind of what's happening. It can sometimes translate complex medical reports into plain language. You will get the results of your tests immediately once they're done, and you'll see them often before your doctor sees them. So you might get a CAT scan report. It can be kind of scary sometimes because it has lots of words in them. You might not understand them. It can explain procedures. The doctor's sending you for something, but you're not really sure what it is, and you can try to understand the basics of what this is going to be. You could try to identify specialists in a condition if you have something that's more esoteric. Are there other people, either here or somewhere else, that could help treat me? And then if you want, you can try to become more versed in your own care by increasing your level of understanding. So this was published in NPR website just about a month ago. The title is ChatGPT Saved My Life. So the story of this, and there's a video where it goes into more detail. There's a woman named Bethany Crystal. She lives in New York City. One weekend afternoon, she takes a nap. Her husband and son are in another room. She wakes up. She has red spots on her leg. She doesn't really know what they are, so she goes to ChatGPT and says, I have red spots on my leg, and she puts some pictures up, and ChatGPT comes back and gives her a long differential diagnosis. It says, you might have a bleeding disorder, you could have a nutritional deficiency, you could have a vitamin problem, you could have a drug reaction, you could have an infection. So earlier in the week, she'd been having some digestive issues, didn't feel well, thought her diet was off, she was under a lot of stress. So she looks at that list and she decides that maybe she has scurvy, which in 2026 probably wouldn't be my first choice, but that's the diagnosis that she came up with. But she was very committed, and so for the rest of the day, she started eating mandarin oranges and taking a lot of vitamin C tablets to try to get her vitamin C level up. But to her credit, she continued to interact with ChatGPT, and there were a total of like 77 prompts. And ChatGPT said, had you had any blood work done? And she said, she remembered she'd had blood work done earlier in the week, and she looked up her blood work, and her platelet count was low. And ChatGPT then said, your platelet count is extremely low. This is a very serious problem. You're at risk for bleeding. You could have internal bleeding, and you need to go get evaluated right away. And to try to emphasize how important it was, ChatGPT had a little ambulance emoji attached to the letter. And so So what she did was in New York City, you take a taxi, I guess. She took the cab in, and then she went to the ED. Her platelet count was 0 at that time. She had an unusual condition called immune thrombocytic purpura, and she was treated, and her platelet count recovered, and she live blogged the whole thing, and she ended up going viral, and this is how this thing got picked up. And so you could sort of ask, did she have to use ChatGPT to get to this conclusion or get treated? And I guess the answer is she didn't have to if the medical system maybe worked better. Like the person who drew the lab, the person who put the value into the lab system, could they have flagged somebody? But those people are processing hundreds of labs a day, and they don't even know the background of the patient. And if this were a transplant patient, that platelet count would not be out of the ordinary. What about the doctor's office? Why didn't they call? And they're seeing maybe 20, 30 patients a day, a lot of people getting blood work. And so usually they don't check your blood work every day. There's not usually somebody reviewing all this stuff. And then you could ask the patient herself, how's the patient going to be able to, you get those results, but the patient, you're seeing a low platelet count, but are you going to understand what that means? And she's thinking, why doesn't the doctor call me? And she's not going to be able to associate a rash with that, which was linked because those spots the medical term for those spots are called petechiae, so that was all tied together. But there's no way. So the system isn't sometimes nimble enough when you have a real emergent condition, which is just, the point I was trying to make is that you have to, just be aware and try to invest in your own medical care and try to, just understand that the medical system isn't always going to respond perhaps as quickly as you would like. And so you don't need to use AI to do this, but just some general things I think that are important is I think I would always advise people to try to understand at sort of a basic level, what am I being treated for? What's the nature of this disease? What drug, if I'm on a drug, like what's it for? We'll talk to patients and that are really highly accomplished in their area of work, but you ask them what they're on, they don't really know. They're not sure why it's on. The doctor told me to take it. What are the major side effects? Is this really is this to cure my disease, or am I going to have to manage this? What does success look like? How do we know we're making progress? What should be realistic expectations? Am I going to get back to normal? Am I going to have a different quality of life? Are there non-pharmacological approaches I should consider? What about lifestyle choices? Everyone in America likes to take a pill for a problem, but sometimes you can do a lifestyle modification, and that can be really critical and significant. When the medical college had to spend several $1 million more than they anticipated in healthcare costs when Wegovy and Ozempic were approved, because it's kind of easy to take a pill sometimes. And then does the doctor, this is kind of, to me, always critical, is what the doctor telling me to make sense? Does this align with my intuition? Does it not make sense? Should I consider, another opinion? Just to leave you, there was a woman who was on YouTube. She was diagnosed with lung cancer. She went to see an oncologist. The oncologist said, you need to be put on chemotherapy. So she starts doing research, and she knows the same thing. She can look at like the genetic profile of her cancer or something, so she does some research. And she comes up with the idea that, actually, I think I should be getting immunotherapy because this is what I've read. And she goes back to her oncologist and says, I think you should think about this. And he says, no, I'm the doctor, you're not. And she gets 2 cycles of chemotherapy, and she progresses. She doesn't respond. So finally, one night on a weekend, the doctor calls her back and says, you were right. And he switches her therapy, and she goes into remission, and she starts a nonprofit organization to try to help other patients with this. And, she ended up being on YouTube. So just to emphasize, your body is staggeringly complex. I mean, what God designed is really amazing. Your heart, if you live to be 70 to 80, your heart will beat 3 billion times in your lifetime. And you can imagine anything that man could design that could function that well with like no maintenance and the electrical conduction that has to happen every time your heart beats. You know, all the things that have to work in your body when you just get out of your car and walk into church and sit in a pew. You don't even realize all the things that, you know, have to work together. And so I would just always encourage people to you know, invest in your care. Whatever calling God's laid on your life, you execute that through your physical body. So as you maintain your health, you know, perhaps that allows you to go longer and maybe have a more significant or longer impact. There's a physician at the medical college who, I think he's older than me, but he does missionary work in Nepal. So he has to traverse from village to village in Nepal at probably, I don't know, 10,000 feet above sea level. And so he has to have the wherewithal and the health to be able to do that. There probably aren't a lot of people that can do that. So as we kept thinking, you know, I kept thinking about personalized treatment, personalized cancer therapy, personalized medicine. It just led me to, you know, to realize that, you know, God used a really highly personalized approach for everyone, that we're all unique, and there's so much intricacy in each person. So, you know, invest in yourselves and invest in your health care to try to, you know, optimize this great gift that we all have, which is really remarkably complex.
All right. So we're going to be talking about AI and assisted reproduction, mostly IVF and embryo selection. I do have a lot of slides I need to get through, so I'm going to just kind of pick and choose. I might have to go over some of them, but I'd be happy to talk to anybody after the talk if they have any questions. I just want to start with this quote from one of the companies that's currently using AI with IVF. They call it IVF Plus. Meet IVF Plus, the new way to bring your baby home. You can choose the path that feels right for your family. And just a reminder that we are all making choices each day, right? And we have options. And so the important thing when we look at AI and IVF is obedience to God's word, glory to God, not what's feeling right in the moment and what works for us. So I just think we need to remember that it's a lesson for all of life, but especially for this. I want to just reminder of what God says in his word. God created us in his image for his glory. So Genesis 1:26, God said, let us make mankind in our image. We're going to be seeing how IVF, we are making people in our image. And we are not trusting God's wisdom in this. Exodus 4:1, because we are destroying human embryos who have disabilities. Who gave man his mouth? Who made him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Right? God has wisdom. He has a reason for everything. 1 Samuel 16:7. It's not the appearance and traits that matter. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So important reminders as we move forward. In vitro fertilization, just a quick reminder what in vitro fertilization is. So it is artificial reproduction, okay? So instead of conception happening inside the womb, it happens outside the womb. And this is a very grueling process, actually, that these couples have to go through, particularly the woman. So she has to take drugs, she has to inject herself with these drugs so that she can stimulate her ovaries to produce many, many eggs. And then they go in and they surgically remove those eggs, and then they retrieve them, and then they collect sperm from a man, and then they actually do the fertilization outside the womb. So once there is sperm-egg fusion, that is the beginning of a human life and a human being that is alive. It's important to remember that IVF has a very high failure rate. It is efficient, and it does not treat infertility. It's a workaround, okay? That's why it's so infertile. IVF numbers are rising. Right now, they estimate about up to 17 million infants worldwide. In the United States, it makes up for about 2.5% of our population. And so how do they know? So let's say a couple has 20 embryos, okay, that are generated. How are couples going to know Most couples, I don't think, want to have 10 or 20 kids, okay? So maybe they do. Some people, I think, back then, in the past, people definitely did, but these days, most people don't want 20 children. So how do they know which ones to choose? So one of the first things they do, what I'm showing you here, these are real human embryos, right? This is how we all started, right? From the minute that the sperm and the egg were fused, there's a creation of a new, unique human being from the moment of fertilization, okay? Has all the DNA that a person needs from that moment to grow and to form. All right, so that human being for the next 5 days is going to continue to grow. Those cells are going to divide, all right? So one of the things that they do is they look first at the appearance of these embryos, the morphology, right? They do time-lapse imaging to see how are these embryos growing, just to get a feel for, is there a pretty good chance that this embryo, if it's transferred into the woman, will actually survive to birth? That's not a bad thing, right? We want healthy babies. We want babies that are going to survive to birth. But what I'm going to talk you through is that what happens a lot of the times is that, okay, so then some of these are healthy and then they transfer them to the woman's uterus, but for those that they don't think are high quality enough and they don't think are growing well, then they go to a freezer, right? And a lot of them are abandoned, and so we know that there are over 1.5 million embryos that are now frozen in the United States, and that's conservative estimates. A lot of these embryos are discarded just because they're considered low quality, and data actually shows that they're wrong in even making some of these initial assumptions that some of these what they consider low quality embryos that they don't think can survive, when they go back into the freezer and they test it out, they actually do. So some of the initial assumptions are wrong. And then what couples can do, if they don't want to throw them in the trash and they feel guilty about doing that, they can donate it to research where they will ultimately be destroyed. Okay? So just want to remind people that this is really leaving a trail of death and destruction. Okay? So IVF is very inefficient. So we know that over 90% of embryos from IVF die. They're either destroyed, they're discarded, or frozen. It's a very inefficient process. And so what's happening then is that this is also a business. And so businesses are trying to find ways, and they compete against each other. Well, how can we offer the best success rate? So what they're looking to is AI, okay? And it's a very lucrative business. So they want to compete in the market for offering the best success. And AI is promising to provide some of these ways to make it more efficient, more successful, and more of a streamlined process and make it easier for these couples to pick the right baby, okay? So I'm just showing you 3 examples that are very recent. One is they have a new AI model called Embryo Vision, which is going to help in these assisted reproductive technologies to enhance the selection, okay? We have the second one that I'm talking about, Bill just talked about, this whole new era of precision and personalized medicine, now specifically for fertility treatments. And then this last one from China is that they're thinking big, right? They're thinking about how we can apply AI from the beginning of the cycle until the very end, everything in between, and where they're going to overanalyze everything, any data that they have, to try to increase success rates. And so just the definition here, AI offers, this is a quote from the last paper, AI offers a data-driven alternative. Algorithms can highlight patterns invisible to the human eye, where embryo selection is guided not by morphology alone, not by the appearance, but by a symphony of molecular signatures. So what are they really talking about? They're really talking about DNA. Like Bill talked about, we are uniquely and wonderfully made by God, knit together in our women's room, but what they're trying to do now is we know that for years, morphology has been used, as I'm showing you in this first one, to choose high-quality embryos with best chance of survival. That's not new, okay? But we're entering an area now where we are specifically avoiding embryos with disease to try to find healthy babies, right? The healthiest babies, and to select embryos with certain traits, even better babies. And that's the area the era that we're getting into now with AI. So how do they do this? Well, they basically, at this stage, the embryo of 5 days old, it's going to be about 100 to 200 cells, okay? They take about 5 or 10 of those cells from the outside layer, which is going to give rise to the placenta, okay? So they actually take those cells and they isolate the DNA, and then they do genetic testing, all right? And it's called pre-implantation genetic testing. So they test all these embryos and screen them. They dig deep into the DNA and then help these parents try to understand which ones that they should transfer. So pre-implantation genetic testing has been around for quite a while, okay? The very first one on the left is really where it has been focused on in trying to, because there are diseases where there is a clear genetic association. There's one gene that gives rise to that disease. Cystic fibrosis is an example, right? There's one gene called the CFTR gene, and if there's mutations in that gene, and if you pass on a mutation and your partner passes on a mutation, the chance that your child has a cystic fibrosis is very high, okay? So a lot of times they will look at these embryos and just look for just what is that one gene? Is there a mutation in that gene? But a more concerning group of tests, the ones on the right, are these looking at complex disease. And these are gaining a lot of traction. And so what they're doing is that they're looking for these diseases that are polygenic, so they're caused by multiple genes. But it's also really important to know that it's not just caused by genes, it's caused by lifestyle, environmental factors, exercise, diet, and pollutants. So it's not purely genetic, and this is where it gets really complicated. So what they're doing is they're using AI to screen these embryos and then say, well, where do they fit on this risk score? And they determine whether what their polygenic risk score. Okay, so most of us are going to fall. If this happens to us, most of us are going to fall in the middle. But a lot of us, including embryos, we might have some genes where they actually consider us low or high risk. All right. So, but what's even more dangerous about this is once you have the embryo's DNA, you're not only trying to predict what disease they're going to potentially have, which is really unreliable, which I'm going to be talking about, but you can now have the ability to look at non-disease traits. And this is really what's going on in Silicon Valley, where they are setting their sights on building the perfect baby and picking the perfect baby. So they're using the same AI technology to say, okay, now you know which embryos have disease, like cystic fibrosis. Now you know which embryos maybe have a potential risk of disease, later adult onset, but now let's try to pick the perfect baby. Do you want a boy that's 6 foot, right, with blue eyes and maybe has an IQ of over 100? I mean, this is what's going on right now. So MIT Technology is rating this one of the top 10 breakthrough technologies for 2026, okay? So there are about 4 or 5 companies, they're calling it embryo scoring, where basically these embryos are being scored. It's the same thing as determining the polygenic risk score. And then parents now, it's a way for them to pick their future child. There's 4 companies right here that are listed. I think there's now 5, and this is happening right now. So this is just an example of if you go to New York City right now, this is what you're going to see. This is the company Nucleus Genomics that is advertising that IVF Plus and it's an ad bliss. So if you go into these subway stations, you're going to see signs that say IQ is 50% genetics. Go to pickyourbaby.com. Have a healthier baby. Have your best baby. Height is 80% eugenic. Right here on the street sign, these babies have great genes, right? I mean, and then if you go on, there's more of them. I mean, and they're proud of this. They are so proud of this. If you go to their website and they're like, this is IVF done right. Okay? If you go to pickyourbaby.com, this is a letter that they write to future parents. I don't have time to read it all. I encourage you to go, but they give them a scenario like, let's say you have 5 embryos, okay? Now you can see your child's future health. They talk about this scenario of, well, cancer runs in your family. Now you know which ones has the lowest risk of cancer. Now that clarity you didn't have before, you have now. Now you can pick the baby that has the lowest chance of cancer. Well, what happens to the ones that have the highest chance of cancer, according to them? They get discarded or abandoned to the freezer. So this is what a parent is going to see. This is from their website. Let's say you have 5 embryos. It's like it's like a baby as a product in a grocery store. This is like a list of ingredients, right? That you're buying a baby off the shelf. You're going to see what your embryo, you have a boy or a girl, what color eyes, what color hair, what the risk of breast cancer is, type 2 diabetes, what the height is that they predict, the intelligence, and the autism. I just want to pause right here. There's been a lot of studies that have shown that if you take adults and you know what their height is, and you actually run this test on them, they get it wrong. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. So these tests are just incredibly unreliable to be able to predict exactly what your baby is going to look like. It's incredibly expensive. So this is for people that can afford it, right? This clinic is in Beverly Hills, but they're charging $10,000 a month for 4 months. So these things are running between $40,000 and $50,000. These are testimonies from parents. I just want to read this one on because I think this is how the expectations, like if all of a sudden, like how invasive, right? If all of a sudden you're a baby and you've just been born and your parents know everything to know about your DNA, right? The expectations, like, wait, you got an F in math? You shouldn't have. You have a great IQ, right? What are you doing? But this last testimonial, every parent should do this. The stuff we thought was behavioral, it was all biochemistry. We changed how we feed him, how we teach him, how we parent, and most importantly, how we set expectations. I also want to read this quote from the founder of Orchid, which is one of these companies. They have now separated procreation from, they no longer see intercourse as a way to have children. It's completely separate. Sex is for fun. Embryo screening is for babies. This is the founder. We've always sought to protect our children. Embryo screening simply moves that protection earlier. The true moral question isn't whether we should use this technology, but whether we can justify withholding it when it could prevent needless suffering. In 10 years, not screening your embryos will feel like not buckling your seatbelt. All right, so lots of problems. I don't have time to go through all of them. I just want to hit on some of the highlights, and I know Bill mentioned this. So these are controversial, unreliable, and eugenic. That's like the summary right there. I mean, this is AI machine learning at its best on large data sets. We're training the predictor on the data that we have. We can't possibly have all the data of every single human being. So what we're finding is that, like what Bill said, that there's not enough statistical power for minority groups, right? So if you have an embryo that is African American, there's only about 2% of the data is African American, okay? So even the National Human Genome Research Institute quotes, polygenic risk scores will always be probabilities, not certainties. I was on a call with one of the directors of these companies, and he specifically said that this is where you can break the horrible chain of, and so then he had X, Y, or Z, whatever that is. And there can be all this deceptive marketing and promising because it's a very unregulated business, and so it becomes incredibly discriminatory and eugenic. Because what you're doing is this is humans and machines playing God. They are choosing which people should live and which people should die or be abandoned to the freezer. And we are creating human beings in our own image. So what we are, and sorry, I really want to read through all this because I think these are important. So we're basically attempting to eliminate some people from the reproductive pool. That's what we're saying. We're saying that some people have good genes and are better than other people, and that some genes are lesser, and that those people don't deserve to live. We're treating embryos like products. We're trying to achieve this whole idea of perfect health and completely eliminate suffering. I mean, I remember what Pastor Jason said, in one of his sermons, suffering is holy ground, right? I mean, it's becoming like this idea of health is becoming an idol. The idea that the only way that we eliminate disease and disability and undesirable traits is now by eliminating people, right? Because that's what's happening. We're only allowing certain people to live. And it creates this whole, I think, utopian kind of idea that, and the pressure that parents are going to be under, the pressure that they're going to put on their kids, this idea of conditional acceptance, like what happened to love and taking care of our neighbor? And like I said, it's just leaving a trail of death and destruction. We already know that there's the numbers are astronomical, what we know about, like almost over 100 million embryos are considered to have died already. Like, this is only going to make things worse. And so I just want to finalize. Oh, sorry, it's hard to read that top. But what that says is that God is our creator and savior, right? We don't have a DNA problem. We don't have a health problem. We have a sin problem. And this, in my mind, it just is wreaking havoc right now. And just a reminder, this is happening now. This is happening now. So the intrinsic worth of a person is not governed by their capacity to do certain things, right? God made us to all be wonderfully made. We are fearfully and wonderfully made, as it says in Psalm 139. He knit us together in our mother's womb. He knows what's right for us. And our identity is not found in lack of suffering, in health, in longevity, which is really what they're trying to do. Our identity is found in Christ, and we cannot forget that. And I'm kind of reminded how these earthly things will never satisfy. It's like they're trying to attain something that's not attainable. First of all, it's unreliable. It's not even that it's going to even be right, that the answer is going to be right. But the thing is, it's not even going to save or fully satisfy. And I'm reminded of what Jesus said in John 4:13. Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. And just a reminder that God's thoughts and his ways are far greater than what we can ever imagine. And if we think that we know better than God in choosing which human beings should live and which should die, I'm thinking of Tower of Babel, right? This is not going to work well. This is not going to work well. We are talking about changing humanity, and God is not going to be mocked. So, with that, I will stop. I just want to let people know that I have written exclusively about this. Michael and I have our own experience with in vitro fertilization that actually failed. Learned a lot. That was a huge faith walk, I can tell you. So if you want, I can tell you how to if you want to read about that, there's a much longer article that I've written about the sanctity of human life and how that fits into a lot of issues, including IVF. So thank you for your time. Sorry I went over. Happy to ask questions.